Welcome, listeners. You are listening to Crime Tales from Travels, the show where we highlight crimes and similar stories from places we have traveled to and from, places we have spent a fair amount of time, or sometimes even places that we have just passed through, maybe on a road trip. But the latter is what we have for you today, a just passing through mini episode, if you will, from George West, Texas. I'm your host, Kimberly Rotet. Before we dive in, though, please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple and Spotify, and you can follow us on Instagram by searching Crime Tales from Travels. If you're new here, thanks for tuning in. If you're returning, an even bigger thank you for coming back to hang out. You can find the research and show notes for this podcast on the website, caroproductions.net. Crime Tales from Travels is a show from the Caro Productions Network. And today we have a case from you that's a little bit interesting. We're going to be discussing the fatal stabbing that occurred at the live Oak County Fairgrounds. There was a cabrito and steak cook-off in March of 2017. But first, let's ask the question, why George West? And if you happen to catch the Falfurrious, Texas podcast episode, that was also a mini episode. It was the case of Rena Rincons, who was a missing person from Falfurrious, Texas. These mini episodes, I researched the case in the evenings earlier in the week, and as I'm literally just passing through when I'm headed somewhere, in this case to San Antonio, and I've hit the record button on my voice audio app, and I'm simply retelling a short story as I pass by the scene of that potential crime. Not necessarily potential, but the scene where this crime took place in 2017. Don't worry, though, I am hands-free. If a state trooper were to pass me right now, it would simply look like I was just, talking hands-free on my phone as I travel. But because I'm quite literally just passing through, the audio might not be as top-notch as I retell the story. I'm sorry about that. But now, this mini episode, obviously, they're going to be different from the regular episodes. I don't have my computer right in front of me, obviously. I, again, quite literally am driving and just simply retelling this story out loud. With this in mind, these mini episodes tend to be a little bit shorter, but I will be sure to include the research within the show notes, those things that I read before I started my drive, and you can again find that at caroproductions.net. Now, to better understand the scope of this scene, I do want to try to set the scene a little bit. This is the fatal stabbing of a gentleman by the name of Wesley Robert Davidson. He was 38 years old, and he was attending this cabrito and steak cook-off at the live Oak County Fairgrounds. And again, this was in March of 2017. For those folks who may not be as familiar with Spanish, cabrito is a young goat. I know I struggled with that thought for a second too, but context is important. Details are important, so you get the idea. There was a cooking competition, and Wesley was present. Additional context, geographically, and why I can include this in my Crime Tales from Travels content. George West and that live Oak County Fairgrounds, they're on 281 here in Texas, which is the road I take when driving to and from San Antonio and to the Rio Grande Valley and back. I pass the fairgrounds every single time I drive to and from San Antonio, and I quite literally just pass through George West, Texas, multiple times a month. So now that we have set the scene just a little bit, let's dive into what happened. Now, it is alleged that Wesley Robert Davidson was at this cook-off with his half-brother, Michael Brandon Niembro. Niembro is reported to have recently been released from prison. Again, everything that I'm retelling is coming from materials that I had found and read online. Again, in the show notes. But recently released from prison, and he was allegedly at this cook-off assaulting a woman that was known to be his girlfriend. And Davidson went to step in and was stabbed by his half-brother, Niembro. Now, after the stabbing, the Niembro, he fled the scene of the accident. So Michael Brandon Niembro, he did the stabbing. He stabbed his half-brother, and then he fled the scene. And as Niembro fled the scene, witnesses at the event tried to provide life-saving care, or CPR, to Davidson. Medical assistance did arrive, and when they transported Davidson by ambulance to Christus Spahn Shoreline Hospital, that's in Corpus Christi, Texas. Now, for some context, Corpus Christi, Texas is about a 57-minute drive from George West, Texas. Unfortunately, Davidson was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. And that brings us to the search for Niembro as well as the arrest. As Davidson was being transported, law enforcement gathered in the area, and they gathered information from witnesses, and they began their pursuit of the suspect. There were multiple agencies in terms of law enforcement that were involved within this gathering of information and the eventual arrest. There were officers from there in George West, Texas, and nearby Three Rivers, Texas, but it also included state troopers from the Texas Department of Public Safety, or DPS for short. It was actually a DPS trooper that went to Niembro's mother's home, which was only about 2 miles from the live Oak County Fairgrounds, and that is where he took Niembro into custody. Now this brings us to, where does the situation stand today? As of when Niembro was arrested, he was facing anywhere from 5 to 99 years in prison, or even up to life in prison. And as I was researching this case, I had a hard time finding a lot of information about the actual court proceedings themselves for this particular case. I eventually did find that Niembro went to trial in June, I believe, of around 2018. And while I couldn't find a whole lot of material specific to the court proceedings, I was able to find just a little bit of information. Now, what I did find, we do need to take with a grain of salt, because it was people and residents from the community of George West itself that were airing some grievances on social media about things that occurred. Now, again, take this with a grain of salt. I wasn't able to corroborate this with actual court documents, but that's part of what people were complaining about. There was a judge in that same district who sentenced someone for a completely different crime, where they were being sentenced for 10 years for possession of a controlled substance. But people within the thread of the George West community were saying, wow, Michael Niembro, when he was indicted and went to trial, he got 25 years on murder, and someone who, this other individual got half the time. They were really upset that they felt that if the justice system was once again proving that you can take a life and still get away with it to a certain extent, because the other part of some of the airing of some of those grievances of the community were there wasn't anything in the local papers about the murder sentence. It wasn't necessarily mentioned in the local media. That could be partially the reason why I was having a hard time finding some of this information. So two completely separate situations, but kind of bringing together what I was able to find on the sentencing of Mr. Niembro for the murder, the fatal stabbing of his half-brother, Wesley Davidson, and 25 years. Now, that is a wrap on our mini episode, as I, again, quite literally am just passing through George West. These mini episodes are clearly much shorter. It really comes down to kind of retelling a story that I can remember from doing the research earlier in the week, but I really do kind of like doing some of these where I can tell this story out loud as I'm driving through that community itself. As I was retelling this story, I drove through George West and drove right by the county fairgrounds there, the Live Oak County Fairgrounds. That's really interesting for me as the researcher and the individual trying to retell this story, and I hope it's interesting to you as well. Again, the regular episodes include a fair amount more detail because I'm at home in the home office and sitting in front of a computer with all of the research. But again, you can find all this information via the show notes page at KRoadProductions.net. And just, I guess for now, just please recall the premise of those mini podcasts. But certainly thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed today's episode. And honestly, until next time, I kind of like to close our podcast out with the request to have everyone stay curious and stay safe, but always remember too that sometimes the truth can be stranger or more disturbing than fiction.